Sometimes night has a way of making things easier on us. You can go unnoticed at night without fear of others seeing what you're doing. You could take advantage of the shadowy places, perhaps because you have no business being seen in broad daylight. In Nicodemus' case, he's a Pharisee, a student and teacher of the Torah, one consistently, among others, at odds with Jesus' teaching. Have you known the night? It's a vulnerable place to be. Unsure of whether or not others may judge you for being seen, let alone being seen with this Jesus. You may be discovered, ratted on, outed. Your story is precious to you, but will others see your story in the same way? But something tells Nicodemus that this Jesus fellow is sincere, genuine, and authentic, truly one with God. But nevertheless, you being seen with Jesus could trigger all sorts of human responses and reactions. When you have a questionable identity, when you're breaking away from the norms of your Pharisee people, night may be your only option to approach Jesus. The world has made it too difficult for you to be your whole self in the light of day. So I was thinking about this question when I came to this text this week. How many of us have felt the need to meet Jesus by the cover of night? Maybe you know someone who's had this experience. I think of those who avoid the uncomfortable stares of others as they walk in and head into the homeless shelter for the week. Or maybe those who don't want to have any human interaction on their way into the AA meeting for fear that someone may condemn them. I think of those who have recently been released from prison who are trying to reacquaint themselves with Christian community, but still leery that others may condemn them to darkness. The immigrant who fears coming out in the daytime because when the light shines on their skin, they are automatically criminalized for who they are. Or maybe, like many of us, we are those who live with countless doubts as to whether this Jesus folk is who he claims to be. There's something to be said that Jesus is approached by someone not in broad daylight, not in Sunday worship with all of us, but by the cover of night. So there are two ways I propose we might hear this story. I'll offer one which I struggle with, and then I might challenge us to hear the story from a different angle. One way we might read this story, this encounter, is as an exercise in avoiding public humiliation. Nicodemus, a teacher in his own right, doesn't want to hear his colleagues hear him openly wrestle with deep theological questions about what it means to be born by water and the Spirit. You see Nicodemus wrestling with Jesus' response. So you're saying that my mother will have to carry me 9 more months? There'll be 9 more months of labor for me to be born again? No. You can see Nicodemus struggling with wrapping his head around what it means to follow Jesus. And they play this word game of semantics, flesh, spirit, seen, unseen. He's struggling to make sense, perhaps like many of us, what it means to see and experience the world in the way Jesus has. I don't know if you figured it out, but that endeavor doesn't happen overnight, folks. Our attitude may be one of pity on this Nicodemus fellow. Perhaps he is not yet the mature disciple that Jesus is looking for, too embarrassed to raise questions confidently because how his colleagues might treat him. But that is the reading of this text I struggle with. Nicodemus is one of those characters in Scripture that often gets a bad rap for asking honest questions of Jesus. Might we consider this angle? Nicodemus raises the question, how can these things be? I've asked that before, and perhaps you have as well. What does it mean for me to follow Jesus when this is going on in the world? I asked that these last 48 hours. How do I follow the Prince of Peace when the world feels the furthest thing from peace? Or perhaps you have asked the question, what does it mean for me and who I am and whom God has created me to be to follow Jesus in this world? It's a fair, honest question, not one we should discredit from coming from Nicodemus's lips. And frankly, it's a question we all might be asking ourselves during this season of Lent. How will God somehow make a way and usher in light in a season of perpetual night? How might we come to see things through Jesus rather than the biases and narrow lenses of our own hearts and minds? The first appointment I served in Northern Virginia, we were planning for an evening Bible study. And someone who I had never seen before made their way into the lobby, or narthex, I can't remember what we called it. But they were coming in, and clearly with tears in their eyes, came up to me and said, "Can I be baptized?" And I said, "Well, have you been baptized before? Because if you're United Methodist, we don't rebaptize." And he said no, that he had just left an extended season and stay in rehab for an addiction that had not only consumed his life, but had broken relationships with his family and closest friends. And he felt that of all places, that a church, there would be at least one person who would embrace him and welcome him into the community of faith. I grabbed a couple of the staff from upstairs and a few church members who were there early, and we held a service of baptism with the witness of others by the cover of night. One who was afraid to come on Sunday morning to be with everyone else, but who expected Jesus would meet him where he was with unrelenting grace. And I've thought about that for so many who fear approaching Jesus, knowing there may be others who condemn us to the night. In this passage, we have perhaps one of the most famous scriptures of all time that even non-Christians probably know it by heart because they've seen it at a football game on a poster. Or maybe you've worn it on a bracelet. Or maybe you have that verse tattooed on your body somewhere. That's okay too. But my challenge is that verse, as much as John 3:16 has been used to build up others, it's also been used to bring a lot of people down. It sounds exclusive if you don't read beyond what Jesus says. For what does Jesus say after "For God so loved the world"? God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world. And friends, I think sometimes we are so good at performing love, but we often have a hard time refraining from condemning people. And yet we almost make it part of our spiritual practice to condemn others. When we condemn someone like Nicodemus, we make it as if no one is free with their human agency to wrestle with the deep questions of the faith. to ask what it looks like to follow Jesus with our whole self. It leaves little room for doubt or to be curious. All those questions you would have liked to ask in confirmation class when you were growing up. Nicodemus is no spy or double agent for the Pharisees just trying to set Jesus up in another trap, nor is he representative of the ignorant, hopeless people who will simply never get what it means to follow Jesus. Last time I checked, the disciples struggled with that too. But honestly, Nicodemus is one who longs to know where he fits in the grander scheme of things. You know, too many people, when it comes to faith, get stopped from asking the hard, honest questions. Either you have the knowledge or you don't. Maybe you've been in a Sunday school class like that, where you're expected to know everything, but it's okay to not know everything that the one person who answers all the questions does. But maybe you've been in a church like that as well, where you feel as if you have to go through this journey of faith having everything under your grasp. But then again, how are we following God if we are not constantly learning what it means to follow God? We've made uncertainty a bad thing, and we've made doubt a bad word. Sometimes we don't imagine faith could be present in a particular kind of person. We assume that everything's just written off the way it is. I've heard quotes in churches I've served where people say, God did not come to save you. God's world doesn't include you. Too many of us, as I said, don't venture past John 3:16. And so I ask again, have you known the night? For most of my life, I've known the night. In fact, for most of my ministry, I've known what night feels like. I wondered if Jesus and I were compatible with each other because others went through life implying that God's love was not made for someone like me. That God's grace was somehow selective. You bet I had a good conversation with Jesus. You can imagine I had my doubts. You can imagine many a night I confronted Jesus with, how can I follow you when these others say, I'm not called or I'm unloved because of who God created me to be. I had grown up with family who told me countless times that God's love was unconditional and grace-filled, yet I found myself navigating a world that spent a whole lot more time condemning people like me. I struggled with that. I couldn't be my full, authentic self in the presence of Jesus, at least by daylight. Night was safe. But I tell you what, in a long life of being closeted, Jesus met me each and every time. Jesus remained faithful, even by the cover of night. And so I ask, maybe you've known the night for some reason or another. Many others know the night today when it comes to their faith. Each person's story is different, but the one thing we share, like Nicodemus, is that our desire to know more of the Jesus who loves, doesn't condemn the world, is always faithful. Even in a day and age in a world where it seems the opposite. Night is not the playground of evil. Night is not bad. Night is simply, as the Celtics say, a thin space where light is more pronounced. Where light is more fully on display when we need it the most. When we find ourselves longing for God's amazing assurance and love to accompany us wherever we may go. I love where Nicodemus' story ends up. After this encounter with Jesus, our next encounter with Nicodemus is the one Pharisee who speaks up and says, shouldn't this Jesus deserve a fair trial? Imagine speaking up, a voice of dissent amidst people who thought something differently. Maybe that's been your night season. But at the very end of the story, Nicodemus is one of the few who shows up before the dawn breaks to offer burial spices at the tomb of Jesus. Jesus met Nicodemus at night when no other would give him the space to ask, when no one else could have taken him seriously. Jesus met him where he was most fearful. Lent is a season where Jesus is always encountering us by the cover of night, where we are longing for clarity and where we are our most vulnerable, where our hearts ponder the mysteries of God and the world around us would try and silence those curiosities. The journey toward Calvary looms with darkness, but I believe there are glimpses of light creeping in all around us. Amid our questioning, fasting, wrestling, and doubt, lest we forget our story always began in darkness.